Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. I hope you are well. This video is meant to provide a brief introduction to Olympic sport and how decisions are made and who governs these massive sporting events that we see every 2 years on TV. At the end of the video, I also want to give you a couple of questions for thought, and then I'll have you go to Blackboard and participate in a discussion board. That's worth 10 points. So I'll give those instructions to you in about 10 minutes, okay? So for those of you who want to hear a little music while you listen to me ramble on, click on Ryan Lochte's face. Cute guy that he is. You'll remember him as a swimmer from the 2016 games, and he got into some trouble. So click on his face if you want a little music, okay? So let's start talking about the Olympic Games, both what they were thousands of years ago and what they've become recently, beginning in 1896. So the ancient Olympic Games, as many of us know, began in Greece, but maybe you didn't know how long ago. They go all the way back to 776 before Christ, or before the Common Era, and it was a Greek sporting festival that really brought together a lot of the different culture of Greece. So the religious culture, the social culture, and really the games were meant to serve as worship to the Greek god Zeus. So everything about them were symbolic in nature, everything about them were larger than life, and people would participate in the events you see here: chariot racing, boxing, wrestling, discus, pentathlon, many of the sports that we still have today in the modern games, as well as some old school games that really we don't see very often. The bummer is that only men were allowed to compete. This was a very male-dominated hierarchical society. So women had to sit on the sidelines, well, not even sit on the sidelines. They couldn't even really spectate unless they were at a distance or unless husband told them about it later on. And as we'll see, even when the games were revived in 1896, women were still not allowed to participate until about the 1920s. So in 393 AD, the Greek Emperor Theodosius had enough of the Olympic Games. He had become a Christian and was mandating Christianity as the official religion of the Greek Empire. So he officially ended the Olympic Games because mostly he thought that they were, a pagan religious ceremony, and that they were not serious and that they had no real business for a Christian nation. So it wasn't until the modern games were revived in 1896 that we really saw a reemergence of these massive international games that we all watch and that many of us love. But there was a good couple thousand years, 1,500 years, that went by between the ending of the ancient games and the beginning of the modern games. So let's talk a little bit about the scope of these modern Olympic Games. So even in the Bible, we see the importance of the Olympic Games in the ancient context. So even Paul in his epistles uses sport and the Olympics as metaphors for the Christian life. So he talks about competing as an athlete, running the race where only one receives the prize, and having a self-control like an elite athlete, or straining to take hold of the prize and the goal in Christ. So even the Christian life was connected with something that the ancient audience would have understood: the Olympic Games. All right, so let's move on to the modern Olympic Games. There was one man who almost single-handedly revived the ancient games into their modern form. His name is Pierre de Coubertin, and he was a Frenchman, and he was rich and noble. So think of him sort of like the royal family in England, except he wouldn't have, become king or even a prince. He was a baron. So he had good access to the elite members of society, and he was a master networker. He knew how to bring people together. He knew how to get things done. And so that's what he did. He brought a bunch of people together in 1894, and he basically manipulated them with good thoughts about education and sport and increasing international peace and the arts and international goodwill. And he basically tickled their ears, and everybody agreed that, wow, we should renew the ancient Olympic Games. So in 1896, we had what would be the first Olympic Games of the modern Olympiad. You see here how many nations participated. It was a much smaller affair, but still a lot of the events that we currently participate in were taken up in 1896. Let's talk a little bit about the principles of the Olympic movement before we get into how these games are governed. So Pierre de Coubertin saw the Olympic Games in very lofty ways. He thought that the Olympic Games could really create a way of life. So the Olympic Games were about much more than games or sport. They were about harmonious development of humankind. They were about preserving human dignity. They were about the joy of effort and the educational value of sport. So because Olympism was so lofty and was so important to Coubertin, he set up the International Olympic Committee to be the supreme authority, to make decisions, really all decisions related to the Olympic Games, so that everybody could participate in the sport that he valued so much. And even so, we see in the 5 rings, these were supposed to be what were then the 5 continents in the world, which obviously there are now more, but these rings are designed to symbolize kind of the international goodwill and the peace and the education that would come as athletes from all over the world competed. So when we look now into the 21st century and we view, let's say, the Rio Games or the Pyeongchang most recent Winter Games, we see the Olympic ideals in action. We see what a massive cultural festival the Olympic Games have become. We also see what tremendous economic opportunity they provide to the host nation, as well as some real economic challenges. How does Los Angeles create all these new sport venues and transportation structures in order to successfully host the games in 2028? Well, LA does it pretty well because we hosted the games in 1984 and we hosted the games in 1932 and we have the Coliseum and we have railways. But let's say, emerging cities and emerging countries, when they try to host Olympic Games, often they overspend. So there's some real economic hardships and challenges that come when people and countries take on such a big cultural festival and event, and they overspend. So along with all the good that comes, there's some real challenges as well. So even, challenges like the current health challenge that we're seeing with COVID-19, where sometimes we can want to press on with these massive sport cultural festivals, even in the face of mounting evidence that maybe we shouldn't press on and we should press pause on the games. And real quickly, there are also social issues that, as well as economic issues that always come up. You guys may not remember, but this was Bruce Jenner, who in the 1970s was a fantastic decathlete, participated in the decathlon. Well, recently, if you remember, he was one of the first celebrities to come out as transgender and really identify himself as a woman. So for a lot of people from my generation, suddenly sport was the vehicle for introducing many of us to this emerging social issue of transgenderism. So how are the Olympics governed? The group at the top of the decision making is the International Olympic Committee. A couple of things that are unique about them. It's a nonprofit, such as many of the sport governing bodies that we've studied in previous weeks, but this group is completely independent of any nation. In fact, if you look at the bottom here, if I was a representative from the United States to the International Olympic Committee, they would tell me, hey Sean, as a representative, you don't represent the United States to the International Olympic Committee, you represent the IOC to your country. So it's absolutely about protecting the interest of the Olympic movement. It's not about pushing the agenda of the United States onto the IOC decision-making body. So Pierre de Coubertin, surprise, served as president for almost 30 years. So really the first 30 years of the modern Olympic Games, he presided over the IOC as president. And he elected a bunch of his friends to serve on the executive board. Well, since then, obviously, there have been some problems and some ethical things that have, surfaced in the decades since. So the executive board, while it's still the primary policy body, the president and the VPs and other representatives are more diverse, and they're elected not just by the president, but they still remain the primary decision-making body. So in that way, the IOC is very centralized in how it makes its decisions. And they make their decisions yearly at the annual meeting, and they really make it in isolation. So unlike the NCAA, they don't really have member institutions bringing items that the IOC votes on. Certainly the United States Olympic Committee or the Italian Olympic Committee can make suggestions for the session to consider, but the session can create its own agenda as well. So in this way, the Olympic movement is especially centralized, and the IOC really is the primary decision-making body. So what types of things do they decide about? Well, one of the primary things that the IOC decides on is who gets to host the Olympic Games. But they also decide on things like doping and how to protect the athletes, or how to ensure that there's as much peace as possible in the world during the Olympic Games. So for example, the IOC would even give advice to South Korea. When South Korea hosted the 2018 Winter Games, the IOC was engaged in diplomacy to try to make sure that South Korea and North Korea would get along during the Olympic Games so that there would be no problems. Let's transition to talk a little bit about governance of the Olympics. So the IOC makes a lot of money anytime they host an Olympic Games. Some estimates show that total to be several $billions. Obviously, a lot of people want to have influence and power to control that amount of money. So the national Olympic committees, the international sporting federations, and even the organizing committees that actually host each Olympic Games want to influence the IOC, and the IOC remains open to bribery and remains open to corruption. So over the years, there have been changes in policy in order to reduce and prevent this corruption from taking place. And yet those anti-corruption efforts aren't always successful. So I'm going to quickly show you a couple slides on governance issues. I'm going to have you review those on your own, and then I'll talk briefly about your assignment. So here's some of the issues. Choosing a host city is an ongoing problem for the IOC to govern. Sponsorship of the games and who gets to share in television monies is also a major challenge. But for now, go ahead and press pause on your video so that you can view this assignment.